Okay, welcome all to Awake, Aware, Arise. We are on the third day of our global conference event. The topic for today is recognizing and overcoming biases. With me today is the panelists Anita Gupta, Swaroop, and Rashi Goel.
Hello.
I would like to start today's session with a small quote that I picked up from this American poet, Chris Jami. It says, "It's not at all hard to understand a person. It's only hard to listen without bias." The first panelist is Rashi Goel. She's a marketing professional. She comes with a 23 years experience. She's worked with FMCGs, majors like L'Oreal, Unilever, Coke, Pepsi, and now she's working with Nestle. She is their marketing and consumer communications head. She's a global citizen, having lived, studied, and worked in India, Singapore, Bangkok, San Francisco. She's pursuing her ICF EMCC certification from Kocharya. She's trained with Anita Gupta. Another learner of Anita is Swaroop, who is in the panel. Swaroop is an emerging coach and an HR professional with close to a decade corporate experience. In the past, he held several roles as a talent manager, HR business partner, software developer, before moving to his current role as a global rewards business partner for Schneider Electric's, I don't know if I've pronounced it correct, Swaroop, Electric's Middle East and Africa zone. Swaroop is an engineer and holds a postgraduate degree in management specialization in human resources and strategy. He's a certified neuro-linguistic programming professional and also certified in applying and analyzing Hogan personality assessment. Welcome, Swaroop. Okay, Anita Gupta, I think most of the people who've joined here, they know Anita. She comes with a rich experience of 35 years in the technology space with global players, mid-sized scaled organization and startups. Anita is a master certified coach from ICF and an EMCC senior practitioner, and she's now enjoying executive leadership coaching across industries. She's a coach trainer and a mentor coach for Kocharya's ICF and EMCC accredited programs. She's passionate about coaching and ethics. Anita has been working very closely with ICF to support the global coaching community. I welcome you all. With this, Anita, over to you.
Thank you so much, Smita. And it's always so embarrassing actually for me to keep hearing as to for introductions. But since you've done it so really well, Smita, I'd like to first thank you. And while a lot of us know Smita as the ever responsive, ever supportive, smiling person, I'd like to share a little bit more about her in case you don't know. So she's an MBA finance, was a banker, took a break in her career to take care of her two wonderful sons. She works with Kocharya, Bangalore, recently completed her ACTP and is, and we actually await celebrating her PCC with ICF very shortly. So thank you so much, Smita, for all that you do and for taking my calls and messages at the dead of the night as well. So 2002, we were just discussing that actually before we started. So what a year it has been. The pandemic, ecology changes, the climate changes, Black Lives, Me Too's, closer home in India, kind of seems a little distant, but the Pehlu Khan, the anti-CAA, etc., life just goes on, right? But what this has taught me this time is that, that I have been privileged and have had no right to crib about what could have been better for me. So for the first time, quite a few times, almost every day, but not as much as what I would have loved it to be, I am trying to see the world from the eyes of those that have not been as privileged while my life has cruised along. But I must say that I am also a bit scared because at this particular moment of my awakening and perhaps even with a fleeting romance with awareness, so why these things might be happening, etc., to take a pause and reflect. I do feel that this will pass, and very soon I'll just go back to my usual ways, because that's how I have always been. Something that comes up, society gets me mad. I speak with others. I think I've done it. That's it. And I just move on. But this time, it does feel like there is some force that's shaking everything, everyone, till we surrender and change our ways. But change towards what? What is the goal that I as an individual can relate to, so that I feel anchored towards a goal, much like we all as coaches help our clients with anchoring to the future. So I think with all this 2020 happening, I'm in the process of defining a goal that will inspire me to do something which is different. So I am now defining it, not yet refined, to be perhaps a better place for my son to live in. Which is an equal place for everyone, including ecology and everybody else, to coexist. And then within that space, everybody will maximize their potential, because there will be this happy level playing field. But I realized very quickly also that it starts with me wanting to have the courage to look inside, see what have I been doing or not doing unconsciously or perhaps consciously that's not making the world the best for my son. So with that said, I'm just happy to be not just the individual doing all this thing of changing the world, because I do believe that I am part of the system, really happy to be part of a system. So this AAA series from Coach Arya is a brilliant platform, I feel, for everybody from around the world to throw in ideas so that we can look at how to deal with this new unknown world. And because some of us also with EMCC, so EMCC's D&I policy endorses the right of individuals not to be discriminated against. And I'm sure all of you would have also read ICF CEO's Magdalena, making a statement on behalf of all of us, which says, and I'm going to just read that, the continued perpetuation of system inequality is at odds with our shared values and vision. As coaches, we consider our clients' context, identity, environment, values, beliefs, etc., as we partner with them in unlocking their potential. However, we cannot help our clients reach their greatest potential unless we also work against entrenched conditions that limit it. So while the statement could be unpacked in several ways, Rashi, Swaroop, and I are picking up one that we believe is central to this theme, which is bias. Because, simply stated, biases lead to these discriminatory behaviors that really need to stop. So with that, over to you, Rashi.
Thank you, Smita, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Anita, for the setup. Really happy to be here, and today, over the next 40 minutes, we are going to talk you through a journey that the three of us took over the last few weeks of developing this conversation and this presentation for you. And we believe that in the process of writing this presentation and having our discussions itself, all three of us discovered some biases that we held. And so we are going to walk you through this journey that we took, where we start off by sharing with you what we believe to be the origin of bias, and we take you back to the caveman days. We talk about how implicit bias becomes societal bias and a conscious decision by mankind and womankind. And then we really bring that down to a coach level, and we ended our discussion feeling very, very empowered and very optimistic, because we felt that as coaches, even one by one, with every conversation we have, we can start addressing bias. But the journey begins with us. And that's really what the format of our conversation today is. So before we launch into how we address it as coaches, The first thing we started looking at is how is bias born? Where did bias come from? And we found ourselves going back to Daniel Kahneman's research on system 1 and system 2 programming into our brains. We actually have two brains. A system 1 brain is really the amygdala, the ancient brain, the lizard brain that we all have. And what this brain does is that it leads to unconscious, spontaneous, rapid, very, very quick processing of information, and that leads us to respond in a certain way. So our thesis is that bias is programmed into our brains. Why do we say that? We're going to take you on a discovery that we had right from the caveman days. So imagine when we were cavemen, anything or anyone that looked, felt, sounded different than us could be an enemy. We could be prey or we could be predator. Hence, when we came across anything that was different, animal or man, our brain fired a fight or flight response, because in those days you could either be killed or you could kill. And over time, this became wired into our system that anybody who's different from us is an enemy. You either kill him or you die. And that, we believe, was the origin of bias. As animal kind evolved, and we know all about the survival of the fittest, we believe what this led to was some kind of wireframing, which said that anything that survives is good, anything that does not is bad. And it may have led to very, very, very different wiring into our brains of what is different and good and what is not different and good. So let's share with you a few examples. For example, we know most fish have eyes, and that is a bias we have. However, the fish that live in Death Valley of Australia have evolved into having no eyes. The fish we all know the story about the mammoth that actually died when the ice age ended, but a hardier gene pool of the mammoth lives till date in the form of an elephant. We also learned during our research that beauty and aesthetics is wired into the animal kingdom as something good. And there are enough and more biologists after Charles Darwin who have proved that fitness is actually a downstream effect of aesthetics. So one would imagine that a peacock who has such a big but beautiful tail cannot fly because the tail is very heavy. But as it turns out, these biologists discovered that it takes great level of gene pool fitness to grow such a big and beautiful tail. And that is why the species is not just beautiful, but also fit and therefore survives. Now, this is how nature has worked across the animal and plant kingdom. But we humans are, of course, smarter, because with each evolution and every stage, our brains evolved. And we started making sense of what we saw around us. And this kind of bias started getting wired into and became system 1, and over time became system 2 responses. So let's discuss how. For instance, if there are biological anomalies and some people are born with special biological benefits, these people are celebrated. So we all know Einstein had a larger brain than anybody else, and that allowed him to process information and do what he did, which will last beyond our lifetime as well. We know Michael Phelps. Now he's biologically different. His lungs are bigger, so he can hold in more air. His wingspan is wider. He has a double joint ankle. his body is just designed to be a world-class swimmer. Doesn't take away from the fact that he's an extremely hard worker and diligent. So he has utilized his biological benefits into really becoming a multi-time gold medalist. The third picture is of a person called Kim Peek. And his two brains, the left and right brain, are actually connected, which most of us don't have. And this gives him superhuman powers in terms of he's a mathematical genius and he's able to memorize anything he sees. So these people are called prodigies and they are celebrated. On the other hand, mankind has ensured that we are so biased and stereotyped for beauty that we go to great lengths to even manipulate bodies to make them beautiful. We all know about the Chinese foot binding, which lived in China for maybe 5 centuries or more. The image on the right is about neck elongation, which still exists in Africa. This plays to a system 2 belief in society, and system 2 becomes the conscious, studied response of our brain that we make as social beings, that smaller feet are beautiful, longer necks are beautiful. And ironically, like I said, the peacock becomes fitter because his tail becomes, because of his tail. Ironically, in human manipulation, we become weaker. So foot binding leads to less mobility for women. Neck binding leads to a weaker neck and weaker spine. So if one removes the rings, a person could die because the lungs could collapse. So mankind is taking stereotypes to great levels. However, we must not forget that a lot of these stereotypes are still born from one. And
So I guess, Swarup, do you want to switch over and take over the presentation slides? And I'll...
Yes,
I'm back.
Okay, good.
Sorry, so I went away for a second. And what I was saying was that we don't even realize that a lot of these biases that we are holding come from system 1. And therefore, I mean, there is no judgment. What we need to do is become aware that we are carrying implicit 1 biases. Malcolm Gladwell did this study in the US where he realized that we implicitly are more biased to having taller men as CEOs. So on average, only 14.5% of men in the US are over 6 feet tall, but 58% of all CEOs are over 6 feet tall. Which brings us to the first truth, and really what I said was that biases are system 1. They are automatic, unconscious, and programmed into our psyche over time. We don't even realize that we are biased. Which brings me to a personal story. What we are going to share with you are 3 personal stories, one from each of us, of how the 3 of us have experienced bias, and some of us have actually really overcome bias. So this is my story. I call it dusting. So when I started my career, I was hired into sales by my company. It was a beauty products company. And as an MBA, one has to go through a sales curriculum. One has to do sales on the ground for the first 1 year at least. But the retailers did not know that. The retailers had never seen a well-educated girl from a decent family coming to do sales in their shops. And the way the company I was in mandated that we do sales was by cleaning out the shelves. So we were selling premium skincare products. And in an environment like India, retail environment, products become dirty, gather dust. So every sales call began with me pulling out a rag from my bag, cleaning each bottle of my brand on the shelf and placing it back. Now, stereotypically, this work is not clean work in the retailer's environment. And the retailers could not connect the dots between an MBA student who has to do this as part of her training, a woman who has to do this as part of her training, dusting shelves before a sales call. So I experienced firsthand system one and system two biases, which made it a little bit difficult for me to do my job really well. When I was going through it, I didn't realize it. But now, when I look back, I realized that that was bias and play at play. Now, with this story of mine, I now hand over to Anita to share her story.
Yeah, thank you, Rashi. And it's amazing to have picked that up to say that you did not realize it when it was happening, right? And now, after you are a coach, perhaps, and you're kind of reflecting on things, you see it differently. So I'm going to talk about the second truth that we three thought that are important. So the second truth is that subtle biases are automatically activated stereotypes. So let's talk about that, right? So what are stereotypes? We label them. So it's relating certain groups with certain attributes. That's all stereotypes are. It could be younger people are risk takers, the millennials are difficult to manage, older people, inflexible, though highly experienced, men, great chefs, that's what I think, women, great caregivers, need to be helped in certain societies. Those with a headgear or a bindi, like what I'm wearing, traditional, person wearing glasses, so yeah, must be studious. One with physical disability must be needing help, but do they really? Men of color, greatest athletes. Let's also talk about gender fluidity, national origin, and the list goes on. So when you look at these stereotypes, when these are in our own thinking, that could manifest themselves as overt behaviors or covert prejudices that we carry. And these could be concealed negative opinions about out of group people, people that don't look like us, don't behave like us, don't think like us, out of group. So anybody not fitting into this worldview or our in-group view trigger, for better or for worse, some kind of a different bias in us or a behavior from our side. It could be fight or flight. So with that, I'm going to talk about this personal story. I'm calling it the popcorn story. So this is a personal story. Actually happened, I could still remember this as we were talking about what are our stories. So my story is going to be evolving around how the system one automatic responses could differ across 3 generations in the same family, just with different conditioning and hence different behaviors to the same trigger of out of group person that appeared on the scene, and 3 people from the same family responded differently because of system 1 responses and system 2 perhaps kicking in. So in India, we've always had newspapers being recycled by people who come door to door for the pickup, and in return, they give us equivalent monies. So there was a certain Mr. M, I'm just calling him M, had very limited finances, had been coming home ever since I was growing up. My mom, I remember, used to contribute her bit by taking only half of the monies from him because he was poor, and also used to give him fruits. Now that I think back, the fruits were those that he could just take away home to eat. It didn't strike me that time. Anyway, so that day when it really changed for me was when M was weighing our paper and speaking also with my 6-year-old son at that time. My mom came in with an opened bag of hot popcorn just out of the microwave for my son, who picked that up, offered it to me, and in the next second, offered it to M. That instant, that particular frame froze, and in slow motion, I could see a fleet of emotions and behaviors coming right onto that stage at home. My child was happily hopping, skipping, waiting for M to pick up the popcorn from the bag, of course not wanting to give away the entire wealth to him. M was visibly touched, because of social economic status, I'm sure, and embarrassed at the same time because my son insisted that he dip his hand to pick up the corn from the same bag, much like I had done. So you see the system one response from my son, totally uncluttered. It's a person he knew he had to share, so therefore he shared. I stood still, totally torn between that swelling pride at my son's equality gesture and yet having that lurking fear of M's grimy hands, I have to admit. Yeah, now when I'm thinking of it, it feels really bad. But yes, tipping into the same bag from where my son was going to eat the next handful. My mom, in her language that only I and she could understand, said, just give him the popcorn in another container. And I remember vividly, as to what now what should I be doing. I paused very quickly. The conversation that me and my husband had always to say that our son's pure childlike soul should not be contaminated by us, to the extent that we could. So in that second, I extended my son's hand further to M and told him to take it. My son, of course, did that. I picked that up back again, skipped back to his TV room. My mom rushed back to her kitchen, not happy at all. So what was my mom's system one was the overt prejudice, towards M. Mine was a controlled, thought through response to overcome my system one of danger because of hygiene. Because I think I evolved for equality, not to play up for socio-economic status, but hygiene still exists for me. My son's system one was that uninhibited response, one that really gives me hope that we are towards a much better world than what I have at least faced when I was growing up, and that this generation will change it. And the rest of people like me, if we can self-manage our system one response to a more favorable one at a time, that it will lead to societal change, definitely. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Swaroop for his story.
Thanks, Sanita. Real change, enduring change happens one step at a time, said Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who will be famously remembered for all the work that she did. So my story is about what kind of a change that I, along a few human beings, could bring to this particular village. So what I'd like to, in spite of such rooted biases etched in our minds and hearts, all these collective biases can be managed by just sheer raising of the awareness of all of us. So the story that I'm going to share now is going to definitely be remembered by all of you, because it's a story of deep-rooted faith and beliefs, which are famously practiced by a set of villagers, which has been ongoing for almost 100 years by now. What you're seeing on this slide is an image of a look called as Pole Rama, which is a goddess who is being prayed and praised and revered and almost spoken every day in this particular village from southern part of India, and the place is called Venkatagiri in I've been working at an organization, but I got to know about this from an email that this particular activity is happening, and I wasn't aware of this until I was into my 20s, early 20s. Seeing this email, I was pretty excited about the opportunity that I could go back to my hometown, visit my parents, all sponsored for being a part of this particular activity as a volunteer. You see, at an early age, when I was just getting my first paycheck, I was thinking of saving my money even when I'm thinking of doing certain societal activities. But ironically, when I went to this particular place to do some volunteering work, I was so moved instance and the story that I didn't visit my parents, and I told my mom that I thought this was like a kind of a vacation for me, but I realized that it's a serious business that I was getting into. So what used to happen was, I realized that these villagers have been praying this local deity, and in the hope to save themselves from a lot of illnesses due to various have been hit in the past several many years. The then rajas or the rulers of this particular village introduced a practice to offer whatever that the villagers could for this local deity for them to save from these pandemics. And these are really the biases that we are referring to in this particular story. And as you will see in the coming slides, that the kind of impact it has had on these villagers, that they were not even aware what is happening, and they got onto a vicious cycle where first they trust the god and offer that the next time when anybody in their family is being hit by any illness, they're going to offer an animal. Could be a hen, could be a sheep, could be a goat, sometimes even a buffalo, to be able to save their family from this illness. And with years compounded year after year, you will see that the number of animals that are being sacrificed have touched in lakhs, and it has obviously caught the attention of several authorities like Animal Welfare Board of India, Blue Cross Association, and most importantly, the villagers started reflecting about this, and it was an opportunity for all of us to create that awareness. And what was most unfortunate thing is that all of these animal sacrifices were done in a very unhygienic manner. They did not have properly managed slaughterhouses, and they used to save this meat from this animal sacrifice with the hope that they can consume, and they retain a lot of this meat for their families to consume in the coming weeks and months. Again, the villagers fell ill to the unhygienic practices that they were prone to, and it became a vicious cycle. And in 2010, when I was really getting into the volunteering for this particular activity, I realized that the number of animals was, as you can see, as a newspaper clipping of 2.5 lakhs. I'm sure it must be more than that because just a reported number. But in just a couple of years, we could bring down that number to 50,000. The next year, I took the lead and pulled in several volunteers from my organization. And with the support of several authorities, including the local police, we could bring in the awareness. And you can see me in the picture at the center wearing the white shirt. Of course, it was almost 10 years back. So there's quite a lot of change in my look as well since then. But the best thing that I feel proud being a part of this initiative is that the little rituals that we could help the villagers reflect upon by having an alternate arrangements, as you can see from the newspaper clipping, that they started looking at offering things, not just what they were told by their previous generations, but with the same belief, with the same faith that a little pumpkin could do as much as what an animal would have done in the eyes of the goddess. This has made a significant impact, and all that we could do was just bring in a little awareness. And I'm sure if we go back to the village and talk to a teenager or someone in school, the stories and the narratives have changed dramatically, and which was even appreciated by the Animal Welfare Board of India. So with this, the essence and the moral for me is that collective change is possible. And when I say change is possible, just with an awareness, what can happen is, Rashi spoke about system 1. I'm going to introduce system 2 here, which is the thinking, rational part of our brain. And with a collective consciousness, as we can generate over time, the system 2, the thinking brain, can help us to manage the responses from system 1, which is the limbic brain, which creates automatic responses. And that's specifically the story that I'd like to share, and it's a story of hope. It's a story of possibility of change, and it all starts with individuals, but collectively, all of us can manage the system 1 responses wherever the biases are swaying the decisions that we are taking in our day-to-day life. Over to you, Anita.
So thank you, Swaroop. That was so powerful. And yes, there is a message from Raghav for you to say that, this thing could perhaps be redone at other festive occasions like Ramadan and Muharram too. And I'm sure that there'll be others. So that's a beautiful part of being in this community, right? We will, something else will trigger another person, and it could be an action item for us. And then it becomes a circle for us to bring about more societal change, more individual change. So thank you so much, Raghav, for that. So Swaroop, I'm going to be after your life to do something around these two now. Okay, so Thomas Sowell said so beautifully, it takes considerable knowledge just to realize the extent of our own ignorance. So with that, just because we are coaches, can we assume that we are not biased? We are, after all, seeped into the entire ecosystem of the world, much like every other non-coach as a human is, isn't it? So with that, Rashi, you want to step to the next one, perhaps? Okay, let me just, yeah. So basically what we're looking at is that coaches also could have implicit preferences. Now, what we did just to ascertain this is that we sent out this response to 30 odd globally known people that were known to us as coaches. And this was based on the Harvard Implicit Association test. So what is the implicit association test is all about preferences that are automatic. And the project Implicit is a not-for-profit and of world researchers that have created these tools to be able to look at various attributes that could pop up. What are implicit preferences for each of us? So for those that are interested, this is a lovely site. It's got multiple parameters, but we picked up age, most non-controversial at this particular stage. So we thought, okay, let's kind of pick that up. So look at what the responses are like, right? So this is young versus old. How do we automatically prefer the young or the old? So as you can see, from the coaches that responded, 44% are slightly preferring working with the young people. Strongly associating themselves is about another 25% and moderately 31%. So how could this come up, right? The implicit preferences towards the young. If I am in the strong category of towards the young, potentially I'll discriminate and hire people that are young for the same role. If I'm a coach, perhaps I might be more tending towards giving solutions, leading, etc., and not staying coach-like when I am working with a millennial that's, say, 30 years younger than me. Or I might hesitate to pick up an assignment to coach somebody that is, say, a CX level if I am in my 20s as a coach. But so when you look at understanding these implicit preferences, it's all about first being aware of, do we have a preference? Or is it because we are a coach and we think we can be non-judgmental, we can hold that non-judgmental space for our clients, that we're all good and nothing will ever come up that will affect our performance. So this is a great tool to be able to use. But before we get into the others, age, of course, just comes up pretty randomly, but let's try to take a dive in and see as to what are these other biases and prejudices and other associations that we might be either facing from others or those that we are exhibiting towards somebody else, consciously or unconsciously. So for that, Rashi, can you give me the control back? You've already done that. Okay, thank you. Just bear with me for a second. Okay, so if all of you could go to and follow the instruction in the chat there. So go to menti.com, please. Everybody in the audience would love to have you participate in this. So on your mobiles or on another browser, can you please just go to menti.com and use that code there, 5379418. There are two questions.
I've put on the chat box.
Yeah, great. So we'll just pick up the first question first. And we love people, all of you, to please share. What have you felt when the client was biased towards you? They did not select you because of. Whatever are the words that are popping up for you, please just put that in. Love to see. looks, yeah, the way we look, the profession that we are in or what they were looking for, how young we look or not, accent. That's an interesting one. Totally. The origins, gender, experience, yeah, the way I spoke. Interesting. Profession. So experience is a lot, and age. So quite a few of us think that age definitely has had a big impact on the way that clients select us after that experience. This is a beautiful, I love this tool. It just shows up a whole lot of things that are coming up. I see the color there, seniority, the race, the title, yeah, the dress sense, skin color. Yeah. No gray hair, I love that, yes. And sometimes I think I've got just too much of gray and hence I need to look different. No deep voice. So therefore, yeah, an authoritative voice, right? Yeah.
All of these are so system one, no, Anita? They're all how we look, how we talk, where we come from.
And we've all experienced it, right?
Yes.
And therefore also try to address it by looking different. I can't age, but I can maybe do something to look mid, neither too young, which I can't do, but neither too old. So amazing, poor fit with the image. Yeah. Presentable experience.
Culture, tattoos.
What is that on the tattoos? I missed that.
Yeah, there's posture, tattoos.
Yeah, posture, the height. Height,
title.
Titles, yeah. Amazing. So as we see, this is where, and to Aarti Khandelwal's chat that came up over there, right? This is when either we ourselves or somebody in the coaching fraternity has felt the bias. And how did we feel at that time, right? I remember my first assignment that I was denied was when, that was my first early ones, when somebody said, oh, but we have only people in the company that we ask you to coach in that are top-notch universities, engineering people, as well as top-notch MBAs combined together. And you do not have an MBA. And I was distraught. I said, that's my first one. That was my dream company to work with as a coach. And so what am I here for? So I felt that bias very strongly, right? Yeah. Okay. That's beautiful. So if I were to just request you all to just internalize this, though, as we are not alone when we felt the bias. We all have it globally. So if you were to go to the next one, just hit the next question. And here is, when I have been biased as a coach myself, I know I have been biased towards my client. My client could be a client that's come to me as a coachee, or it could be, if you are a trainer, it could be, the client could be a learner. You could be a supervisor for coaching, and therefore the other person, the coach, could be your client. So this is when we have our biases playing up. Mannerisms of my client and perceived value systems being different. Phenomenal.
Right now, value systems has the highest number of votes.
Amazing, right? Yeah.
What, Anita, I find incredible is that in the previous question, a lot of the questions were, a lot of the answers were about the way we looked.
Yeah.
On how clients are biased against or for us, and we as coaches are possibly least biased to looks.
Yes, that's an interesting one. So therefore we, yeah, And when we receive it, of course, we are the receiving end, but it doesn't matter so much to us. But what's interesting, and I think this is a very interesting one that I think we'd love to pick up at the end towards the question and answers thing, in terms of the different systems of our clients is exactly what we as coaches are not supposed to be judging or being judgmental towards. So we're supposed to hold all these biases that we're carrying and yet be totally non-judgmental. But values, beliefs, everything that is conditioning us in that iceberg is what we are all made up of. So our behaviors will come up, bubble up on the surface. So how do we control those behaviors so that our clients are served with the most unconditional positive regard that we are expected to as being a coach? So with that, thank you so much. We're just going to keep this and that up again. So it does show that despite the fact that we are supposed to be coaches, we are human, and this will come up. So it's really about understanding our how much are we aware. So it starts with Daniel Goleman, of course, in terms of self-awareness, leading then to, once we are aware of these biases that we carry ourselves, and then we move towards self-management. So how do we self-manage now? Okay, we understand that that we are biased with somebody that has a different value system, belief system, etc., but I'm not supposed to be, as a coach, showing that my presence is impacted, or that I can, not perform my best to be in service of my client. So you look at the reflection. So what all could it be? And there are multiple such things that can happen. These are just some of those things that we thought of between us, because when it came up to us, how did we take care of it? So for sure, self-reflection is about figuring out what are my values, what are my belief systems, etc. I listed them down. I looked at what are the triggers, what are these that affect me so much that it'll affect my presence, that I will say, this client is like this because that person's value system is different. But if I observe my behavior with specific people and in these situations, much like Swiya talked about, my who in the what. It's not my client's who currently, it's about my who. Who am I? How do I come up in the situation where the client is talking about their current situation, and it triggers in me to say, how can this person be like this? As soon as I have that voice asking me that question, I need to reflect and I need to self-manage, because that voice is no place in this conversation when I am working with my client for their needs. It's not my need. And if I need to do anything, I need to control my voice from speaking. So understanding my own unconscious process that's going on. So a few of you heard about this, that when my dad passed away, I still have issues with dealing with that. But when my clients, two of them actually differently, came up and they talked about, the first one that talked about, I need to be patient with my aging dad. That was something that just triggered so much in me that I was already holding a place of judgment, and my presence did lapse because I was judging this person to be not a great son. How can he even think so? At least he has a dad. So a lot of these things came up for me. So what's coming in the way if I do figure that out? And then what do I really want to do about this voice now? How may I have solved for this? Who am I biased towards? How can I manage myself? Potentially, self-coaching is another way to do it, therefore, after the reflection. But reflection is key. So you can reflect, you can use tools, etc. They bubble up to say, where are we not fully present? And then self-coaching, tools to anchor ourselves to the new way of being, whatever helps us. It could be a pre-session centering to be comfortable with ourselves, whether it's via meditation, deep breathing exercises, 3x3 reps, coffee, music, anchoring with NLP techniques, trigger and anchors, whatever makes us singularly focused on the client before and through the session. but reflecting constantly at the end of the session to say, did my presence ever waver? Did any other voice come up to me? So post-session management via reflection will help in continually working on these triggers that might otherwise affect our performance due to these biases trickling up. But if we are not able to manage our triggers via self-coaching, then perhaps we are such a beautiful community of coaches, right? We could seek supervision or even get personally coached. Because again, we are humans. Of course, we'll have biases. Of course, we need to resolve them. Nothing wrong with it. So it's about owning it, accepting it, and working towards removing them. And the last one, of course, that we could think of is nothing like pushing the envelope, to seek out those that are different from us, which is seek out clients. If we think that we are strongly biased towards the young, possibly push to get yourself a client that's much, much older, and then try that out, right? But try it and then reflect, because what you want to do is to make sure that you could deny that implicit bias the chance to operate. You don't want implicit biases to play up against the client so that you can continue to operate from the fully unbiased space. So that's really what we thought of in terms of the techniques through which we have been able to overcome some of our implicit biases that came up during or after reflections. So this stage, Rashi, do you want to take over?
Sure. Thanks, Anita. Thanks, Swaroop, for this conversation. We've now come to the end of what we wanted to share with you. I'll just take a moment more to summarize what we took away for ourselves, and then we would love to get into a discussion with you. So really the takeaways for us were biases ingrained, implicit, and it's just wired into ourselves. And therefore the first thing a coach must do is not judge or berate themselves, but really become aware that there is no way to help it. They have pre-programmed biases. And illustrated this through the dusting and the popcorn story. But then we moved into a more optimistic take on biases, where we realized that even when biases have traveled to system 2 and they become part of culture, habit, and tradition, one act of awareness and change management can overturn the system and remove the harmful stereotypes and biases that we carry. We've also then carried forward this conversation to a coaching space and said the way Swaroop was able to overturn 100-year tradition of killing animals for worship, can a coach, conversation by conversation, and first by managing himself or herself, lead to collective transformation. And we ended up really feeling great about this, where we felt that each and every one of us as coaches have the power to overturn the harmful biases and stereotypes through the coaching conversations that we have. And we can really become change and awareness evangelists, one client at a time. And now hand over to Swaroop and Swati, and welcome all audience comments. Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions which I'm really curious to learn from the audience, as well as Anita and Rashi, as is an opportunity, along with Smita, if you can as well throw some light on this. So the first question that I have is specifically on what kind of a challenges that all of us are facing, especially as you are as a coach trying to self-reflect and manage your biases if you're already aware of it. What kind of challenges do you face on an ongoing basis? We'd like to hear from you and then collectively have some answers within this particular call. Anybody can start sharing your thoughts. Okay, we have Shweta Sivaraman mentioning catching it when it happens. Yeah, it's a big challenge. That's what we are trying to sharpen our senses here to be able to catch them when it is happening. We have Vinita mentioning we don't recognize our biases and think they are our values. Yeah, that's a big one because it's a big conflict, whether it's a value that is creating the conflict or is it a bias that is creating a conflict. Fear of coaching people I perceive to be superior or more experienced than me. Oh yeah, I can relate to that quite well at my workplace as well. Can people please set to okay, this was okay. Any thoughts from the co-panelists on the challenges that are being raised by some of our audience?
So we've got, I would love to hear from Cindy. Do you want to be coming up as a panelist and talk about some of these? I know that you and Svia are very, very passionate about this, especially around triggers and so on. So do you want to pick that up? I know I caught them off guard. I love that,
Probably.
Cindy. No hair, not done. Okay, but you don't need to be on video. You can be off video. Love to hear you.
No, we have an audience who would not judge you based on your looks, Cindy.
Yes. So I do
more questions coming up. Anita,
Yeah,
you were
there is
saying something.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Svia, I think you mentioned, or somebody mentioned the triggers, and there was something relating to that about recognizing, triggers and biases as they come up. So, do you want to talk more about that? I saw some interesting things, observation that came up in the chat earlier.
So, Smita, you're going to promote Cindy as a panelist? She said okay to join.
Yeah.
okay.
For her as well as for Svia, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally, Sindhu, with that on with you on that we're just not aware.
Hi,
Yeah.
Cindy.
Hey, Cindy.
Hi, hi, you can hear me?
Yes, very well.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to be with all of you. So I have a reflective question, and I'd love to hear from the panelists. What do you think is the difference between a preference and a bias? Because I could prefer something, right, that somebody may call that a bias, but really it's my personal preference. So what's the difference between a personal preference and a bias?
Yeah, I can go with my thoughts. Preference is something that is personal and doesn't affect others, is what I feel. If it is a bias, it could be going beyond your own territories and creating any kind of disturbance in the environment. But preference is like, if I'm going to have breakfast, my preference is to a certain cuisine, and it's not going to impact anyone largely unless it's my wife, for example. So a bias is more like you're working in a team, your preferences or borderline biases could affect the team dynamics or even the productive results that we are typically looking at. This is what is coming to the top of my mind.
Yes, I think the word bias carries a little bit of baggage. So, and preference as a word could be used to indicate preferences for daily objects, food, dress, etc. I also feel preference is logical and rational. I prefer to live in Delhi versus Bombay, whereas bias could be I'm living in Bombay but judging Bombay throughout. So bias seems to have an implicit air about it, and their preference seems to have a rational air about it. That's just how I'm processing it.
Hmm.
And I do feel that ultimately, I feel whether you label it as a bias, preference, whatever, as a coach, I just need to take care of it. I need to take care of my preferences that might also show up in a behavior that is not okay. Because if through the preference I get into an engagement, but I've not addressed it as well. So if I'm not fully aware of how that's going to be impacting, it will throw up as badly as a bias. But I also feel that while the bias has a connotation of unfairness, as Bhaskar and others have talked about in the chat, preference might have a positive connotation to it. But my recent discovery was also that biases are also positive. They could be positive biases, they could be negative biases, but we always kind of refer to a bias as negative. But if I am carrying a positive bias, for example, as a trainer, if I think that, somebody says, well, good at picking up concepts, etc., because he's read so much and so on. But if I am biased positively towards him in a recorded coaching conversation, I might be positively be thinking that, oh yeah, he is feel extremely good and extremely competent just because he participated well in the class. Well, that might not be true. So I need to be cognizant of my positive biases as well as my negative ones. So to me, yeah, I don't know if I answered that. Cindy, what's your own thought? That was an unfair thing to do. You kind of got promoted to the panelists to answer the questions, and here you asked a stumping.
So, yeah, I like what you're saying, Anita, because I think sometimes in that reflective process, a bias can show up, in our own reflective process, a bias can show up as a value add in what we are doing. Of course, a lot of biases have a negative connotation to it, meaning it impacts, as Swarab said, it affects and negatively impacts the larger portion of people around you, whether it's your communities or society, in the words and language that we are using. Does the panel have time? I'd like to share an example that came to mind.
Please.
Am I taking up time if I did that?
Please do. No, go ahead, please.
So I'm not sure whether I said this example before, but an example that comes to mind was always once at a conference, I made friends with the lady sitting next to me, just a normal conference. And she was of a different race group than I am. You know, she was white. I'm South African, we call it white. But the topic and the content of the conference had us talking like we were best friends. There was so much of commonalities between both of us. And the strange thing happened is that we walked out of the conference for lunch, and she immediately said bye to me and sat with a group that was all white, a group, and had lunch. And the next morning, you know, when she saw me, it was the same reaction. Oh, I'm so pleased to see you, you know. But the moment we were eating, it was, I'll go to my group. And the same thing happened at lunch. And for me, it looked like a bias. I was quite upset, you know. You definitely have a bias around the people you want to be seen with, and yet during the conference time or thereafter, you're messaging me and we like friends for years around the content of the conference topics. So on the day 3, I decided when she was walking to her group to sit down for lunch, I'm going to follow her and sit with her. And just to test it, because now I'm not just upset anymore, I'm angry. And I'm going to test my anger. So I got to the table, sat down. There was a huge discomfort initially. Perhaps it lasted for about 30 seconds. And people didn't know what to do with me, you know. Suddenly somebody else sitting down at our table. And I'm sure they must have thought she's quite bossy to come and do that, you know. But thereafter, it was as if that initial discomfort disappeared, and we all spoke about the content as if we were all friends for a long time. And it disappeared, you know. And I think if I didn't take that step, I would have continued thinking it was a bias. And later I realized it was just a comfort preference and not a bias. And we chatted about it maybe about 3 weeks later. And she did share, you know, it was just the comfort of eating with people you know, and not knowing how to accept somebody else at a table that was not of your race group.
It's such a beautiful sharing, Cindy. Truly being able to share that space of being vulnerable and still dealing with it in the beautiful way that you did, that inspires me from being able to push myself if I am in such situations, to be able to ask so that I don't sit with that anger inside, right?
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
One thing that you also shared is that picking that up with somebody else that was biased, that you felt was biased towards you negatively, for example, but actually saying, look, I did not feel right. What was it due to? So to be able to be comfortable bringing that up with a person, because at times they're not conscious, she was not doing it with a bias, right? She was talking about it from a context perspective of comfort. But hopefully from now on, she's going to be more inclusive, knowing that there could be others like you who might perceive it to be like that. So yeah, that was a lovely example to share. And I think it reminded me of Carly Anderson's website, where she's talked about that as a white, she was not aware of what it was to be able to see the world from the other side. And that now that she's aware of it, that what is it that we could do? And I think that exists with each one of us as individuals. We are just not able to look at it otherwise. So this is me chatting on that one.
Thank you, Anita.
Swia, you want to share, I saw you also mention about the ICF part of it, picking that up. So go ahead, Swia.
Hi, good morning. I'm recovering from surgery, so forgive my bed, but I would like to show my face. This has been a wonderful way to spend my time this morning, and thank you to everyone, including the people in the chat. There's so many things that are in my mind. However, I think what I would like to have an opportunity to just pick up is a small thread around the metaphors that we use, because I think coaches think in metaphors, talk in metaphors, and even when we don't realize it, we use coaching language as if it's English or whatever, as if it's ordinary language, and it's not. And so for me, what I'm very aware of is I think that as I'm listening, I'm so struck by that we, as coaches, we are encouraged, and I'm a psychologist, so I can be rude about psychology, I guess, is as psychology's way of thinking encourages us to become experts at this conversation that goes on between our ears. Blah, 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 and manage all of that. I don't think that traditional psychology has helped a lot of coaches to become really brave, creative, at the interpersonal, what goes on between me and the other person's nose. In other words, what's between us. And I think the ICF is pushing us as coaches to take partnering very seriously, not just when it suits us. And for me, the topic of bias is not just about what do I do to manage what's going on in my little head, and I better manage myself now. But actually, I can see on the person's face, or I can hear in the client's words, that something I'm doing and being is changing how they are being and doing with me right here in the session. And how can I be the one to make a space for us together to talk with that, rather than for me to retreat into, I'll just fix my ideas about millennials or old people, whatever, or I'll take it to coaching supervision. So that, I want to connect that with my comment in the chat about triggers. I think that metaphors, as I said, triggers, the thing that comes to most people's minds are guns. Guns are not living systems, they are mechanical. So even just the word triggers, you can already guess, I don't like that word so much. But Marshall Goldsmith, I think, did do us a favor by writing a book on triggering, where he proposed that perhaps we should be compassionate as coaches to ourselves and think not just how do I get triggered to be negatively inclined or prejudiced towards someone, but how do I get triggered to be expansive and to own my vulnerability, to be brave, and to say things like, something went across your face as I said that to you. Do we need to talk about what just happened there? I get the impression I might have misstepped, or I might have upset you in some way. You know, those small moments of how can we feel our own little triggers that encourage us, not just, oh, that's my trigger, and I was, you know. So I'm really aware as a coach educator of how people are oppressed by the coaching police, especially the ICF coaching police, or the neuroscience coaching police. And I would really like to leave today with a sense of that, you know, in order to be compassionate with people about their biases, we need to be compassionate with ourselves. And I think that's critical. And any way that we can do that, which is not the same as being not accountable. And like Cindy, I'm a South African, and accountability with a capital A is something I think is just in our blood. Is what does accountability really mean? But I guess I've said a lot, so thank you for all of this time. But to say, I really think this partnering gig, it's such an easy word to say, but boy, does it really bring to us the creativity, the spaciousness, the boldness, the vulnerability, the aesthetics of working with ourselves and other people. And yet, of course, every now and again, you just think, why me? Why this client? Why do I have to go? So thank you. And that's really what I'd like to contribute.
So I'm going to say something. Something's occurring to me. Sorry. So because just following on from one piece of what Svea was saying, that whole partnering thing perhaps is the very essence of what we are noticing as very visible race biases going on around the world at the moment. Like people hanging on to their particular frame and holding on to their, what we want to call bias or their way. I'm sure they're not thinking of it as I have a bias, but more thinking of it as this is my way of doing things and I'm hanging on to it. But I think the in-between piece would be, then how do we partner or get on the table to partner so some of it disappears into a more, I'm not going to say a perfect kind of conversation, that's not going to happen right now, but more start point, start point of what this partnering between parties to drop off biases would begin to look like. I'm done.
So
only until she next speaks. I know, Cindy.
Right, Svea, right.
So thank you so much, Svea, for joining in from your after recovery. You're still not, I think, fully recovered from all that, but just shows the passion with which you relate to this to the coaching world. And Cindy, for your participation. But before I let you both go, let's take a practical example, right? So we got a client, for example, and the person talks something to do with a color of racism, against maybe a team member. So you're trying to coach the person on a particular topic, and in that thinking of this particular client, something comes up where I feel that my client is not inclined favorably because of something that's going on in their head against the team member. So how do I deal with that conversation? Yet partnering and yet being a coach.
Look, I think, we're in the world at the moment between these different core competencies, moving from one model to another. Those people who are ICF people, and we had good old core competency 7, direct communication, which quite a lot of coaches went, I'm great at questions. I don't need to do this observation business. I don't need to give people what I'm noticing. I just do good questions, and that's good enough. and in the new way. So Anita, I mean, for me, I am so aware of needing to almost hold that little sacred space, not with a big capital S and, you know, all clever, but that sacred space of almost asking somebody the question like, and what have you been noticing about how the person responds when you hold that way of seeing them? To try and give them an opportunity as a start to even to have the opportunity in the safety with me to become aware of, I have a way of holding this person in my mind. It may or may not be true. And how is the other person responding to me? And is that to my liking or not, or whatever? So just being able to ask those relationship questions and being brave enough to, you know, to simply to give the client the space to almost do that reconsideration of, oh, actually, when I think about, or, you know, or to ask those questions like, and how might you need to think about this person in a way that would get them to become more cooperative towards you? How would you need to hold them in your sort of regard? So I think we've got a lot of very sort of small, but what I call aesthetic or sacred quest sort of ways of talking with clients that don't give them lessons in how to be a better person, that don't do the manager or HR thing. You know, we have a company policy that doesn't allow you to say things like that about your, you know, even if it's confidential. I think that coaches have an incredible world of interpersonal vulnerability that we can navigate and open for people where they themselves can actually catch, do I, you know, if I want to hold this way of seeing this person or team member, then what does that lead to? And then I can't avoid that. Then I must deal with that because I'm creating that with this person. It's not just this person doing whatever they're doing. So you know, so I hope that gives some possibilities, but for me, that's almost my rule to myself. Open a space for the person to hear themselves and reconsider with me, how else might I be able to think and conduct myself? And sometimes they don't, you know, and sometimes they just say, you know, all those rude words that people use, they just stick with that. And then you go, okay, so you want to hold that person in that way. And at the same time, you want them to cooperate. So let's think about how might you go about achieving that thing.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to
but
do it.
Maybe one thing to add is, and much more difficult for internal coaches, because internal coaches have a responsibility to policies and procedures. So if there is an anti-bias policy, for an internal coach, it can be quite tricky because they can't just agree to, okay, fine, if you just want to think they're blah, 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 you can, you know, that's okay, you can carry on thinking that. So I think internal coaches have a much harder time with matters to do with bias because they have this needing to uphold whatever the climate is that's been set in that organization. And it isn't just the individual coachee's decision about, I want to think that all women are stupid and don't drive properly. And that's, you know, if you're an individual client, well, then you're allowed to just keep thinking that if you want to. Yeah, so I do feel for internal coaches, and I think that they deserve to find spaces in which to manage the fact that they are in a much more complex environment when they're dealing with bias in their coaching.
They would need to also have that confidential, guaranteed confidential space unless you bodily harm somebody or yourself, kind of a disclaimer that coaches start with. So yeah, I hear you say that. Cindy, anything else from your side before we invite some millennials also onto the call to share their perspective of this?
So I can see the smile on your face, but noticed I waited for the invite. But I like what you said. It landed quite in a nice space inside me. So what I want to say is that I found myself recently being quite bold to corporate language, especially language that seemed to favor a particular side and not have this process of inclusion in it. And Savannah knows this, we've had a few chats around this. So for example, when a large corporate says to me something like, we're looking for a few coaches of color, can you do some recommendations? I mean, I found myself immediately, like I couldn't stop the words coming out of my mouth saying, how about you rephrase that? What you mean is you're looking for some experienced coaches. And not coaches of color, or use kind of language that implies a bias, you know? Because we have coaches that are really good, but they may not be the coaches of color you're looking for. So, you know, if HR begins to change their language, at least one person at a time, then, you know, we can find ourselves moving in a particular direction where people are being honored for how they show up with experience for that particular clients they want to work with, and not for the color of their skin or something else. So I find myself suddenly becoming quite bold to that.
So beautifully said, right? So it's for us as coaches to also push and challenge our other stakeholders even before we get to the client, right? So that that 1% change, at least they can be triggered and they change it rather than just accepting it to say, yeah, fine. Yeah. Beautifully said. Yeah.
Anita, may I suggest you download me back into the participants?
Sure. Yes, we've
Thank
gotten,
you.
thank you so much, Cindy and Svea. And we've gotten Shweta, who is a young coach, as well as Komal, who has worked in the past with multicultural flavors. So I thought it'd be interesting to hear their views. But of course, anybody else, please, from the audience, want to have, and this particular thing always triggers very strong, passionate feelings. So anybody please wanting to share it, please do share it, and we'll love to have you on the panel here today. Because it's all about learning. I don't think that we have all the answers at all. So it's about figuring out what would serve us individually and collectively well. So Shweta, do you want to go first and share your observations? What's come up to you?
Sure, Anita. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you all for your insights. I think those 3 words in terms of popcorn, sheep, and dusting will never mean the same to me anymore. So in terms of biases, I think I always say this as a coach, that you can only hold the mirror up for your clients if you do it against yourself first, in the sense that you need to reflect in terms of what your thought processes are, and you know what your gaps are probably in terms of reflections, before you can probably do that in a way that provides justice to your client for whatever they come to you for. And a couple of instances probably where bias came up for me in my coaching conversations, and I'll probably share 2 instances here in terms of how it came up for me. So first, I think it was one of the very, very initial coaching conversations that I had with a client, and we did the contracting and the exploration so beautifully, and they identified what they needed to change in their lives, and it came out to a wonderful place. And immediately the question I asked them was, so what would you do differently from tomorrow to change this, right? And while the client was completely committed in terms of what change needed to happen, the minute they heard the word tomorrow, they sort of stepped back, right? They went completely defensive and said, hey, you know what, I'm just discussing this with you. I'm not sure if I really want to make that change happen from tomorrow or not. And I realized immediately that this was coming from my bias towards action. I'm so action oriented that in terms of, if I were to know that this is not working for me, I will immediately try and find a way to make it happen quickly, right? I wouldn't wait, for the stars to change, for the month calendars to change, none of that. That was my personal way of change. And that simple question, it wasn't even that I had pushed the client, that just including that word tomorrow suddenly made that client so defensive that I realized I had to be so much more conscious in terms of not reflecting my value systems or beliefs onto them, right? So that was one, I think, very powerful learning that I had from my very initial coaching conversations. The other was a little recent, actually. It was a conversation where a woman got in touch with me and was facing body shaming issues from her in-laws because of her color of her skin, right? I mean, she's so drop dead gorgeous that when I actually heard from her that she was being body shamed for it, it was like a shocker for me, right? Personally. And the conversations was going in terms of figuring out how to deal with it. And she reached a point where she said, you know what, there are some things I probably have to compromise on, right? Because she said my relationship with my husband is so pure that I will probably have to compromise on that, and I don't care about the remaining things, and I'm okay with that, right? And at that moment there was this one just, it was just for a small second that I had a thought that, no, you're not supposed to compromise, right? And that again came from a personal bias that women should be strong and assertive in terms of setting their own personal boundaries, and that they shouldn't compromise. But thankfully this time the awareness came in before I said anything, so I quickly said that, okay, if you're comfortable with that, how do you want to take that out, right? But what I also realized was that there are different ways in which people probably change, want to change, or actually take actions or confront in their lives. And it may never probably be the same as what I view it. And it could be maybe from my, my age that, things have always happened my way, that I always feel that this is the best way to do it. And through coaching, I think it's been like an eye opener in the sense that now I'm like, all right, there could be different ways of dealing with it, maybe in terms of how it would work for them. And that is still okay, as long as the client is comfortable in doing it that way and are happy in terms of whatever calls they are taking, it is absolutely fine. So I think for me, the reflections in terms of bias was that, like I said, the most difficult part is catching it before it happens, right? Because it's easy to sit back and reflect once the coaching conversation is over, but by then the deed is already done. So the only thing that I could feel is that if we could catch these thoughts even before we start talking about it, we could be, I think, better coaches without being too biased. I think that was my 2 cents on this, Anita.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Shweta. And every time, for the others, whenever I hear people like Shweta, reminds me of my son, 25, and that bias comes up to say, how come he's not as mature as Shweta is, for example, right? So that's my bias, to say, okay, this is a better way of thinking than what he is thinking, because I don't think he thinks. So, but then I need to kind of look at, okay, fine, everybody is their own individual selves, and therefore I shouldn't be looking at it this way. But beautiful observation, Shweta. Thank you so much for sharing that, because I guess all, especially the younger generation, that's my bias talking again, the bias towards the action being very high, and therefore the fact that we as coaches need to stay with our own selves and say that's what works for me may not really work for the others. So thank you again. So Komal, how about you? You've seen a lot of people through countries, continents, moving across countries. You actually supported them even before you were a coach, and now that you're a coach, how are you seeing it differently?
Okay. Like last 1.5 hours is like whole lot of activities going on here, because all of my corporate life experiences have been coming to me right from whatever I've noticed happening with my clients who've come from all across the world to India, how they've viewed India, what sort of opinions they've formed just by the way of how they experience people, how they turn up for work, or what do they do. And then I have been a part of that generation who's seen the corporate world shift from how it was, and along with that, India shift as a country and a society as to how younger people started to carry themselves, what sort of value we brought to work with, and then how work went on changing us at a level that how do we present ourselves. So all of those experiences are so indicative of the presence of bias inside us. And I absolutely agree that bias itself is not right or wrong. It is what it makes us do. Does it expand us or does it contract us? Does it help us learn and challenge our own way of being, and what are we doing with the system, with the way we are coming across? Because I have personally seen in my own life and experience, because of certain bias, for example, conformity, you would like to conform to a particular group, or you have it in your mind that there are certain attributes because of which people will like you or they will not like you, and then you bring yourself to change according to those ideas or biases that you perceive. That may help you propel ahead in your career and in your life, or that may also help you move beyond your certain set of values and acquire something new. And that could be also very restricting in certain ways also. So there are a whole lot of things. I don't know how much I can bring in this limited time period, but I think one very important thing is to understand and accept that biases are there. They're not going to go anywhere. Our work is not around becoming unbiased, because that's like going against the functioning of our brain. It's more like, what is the bias doing to us as individuals, and what is the bias doing to us as a system? And the question that Cindy mentioned, that, like, what triggered her, this question that, oh, can we have the coaches of color? It brings out such an important distinction that we do identify that biases have eventually led us to do something which is not working for the society at large. And we are trying to address those things with other bias. Like, okay, if we have to work in the sphere of diversity and inclusion, then if we have to show that, okay, we are sensitive or we are inclusive to the values of the people of color, then we need to showcase somebody who is a person of color in the work sphere, and then that's how we will know that we are inclusive. No, that's also another tendency that, okay, if we'll see the people of color more in space, we will feel that we are inclusive. No, that's just the surface. That's just like we are trying to address one bias with another bias. Rather, it's more like going at a deeper level, being more human at the core. Because if anything my 15 years in global mobility has taught me, our differences are very superficial, our similarities are very deep. So being more inclusive means, at a mass level, at a larger level, going and penetrating to our depths, which is not really easy for everybody. It is quite scary, but I think as coaches, so that's one distinction that I've had after coming into coaching, that, what is the area where we got to focus on? Biases are going to be there always. I think what Swaroop has done, what you've done, Anita, what Rashi has done, and what Cindy has mentioned, Swiya mentioned, is how we take biases and help expand ourselves, our clients, the whole system, is something where I think is the best use of understanding and knowing about biases and how they really impact us. I think that's all I can sum up in.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Komal. Yes, as Cindy also picked that up, right? I also did, in terms of saying how do you combat that bias to address yet another bias, right? So the way that we are layering them on top to justify. So I would love to have conversations of this one, just continuing on, but I'm totally aware of the time. So we are 3 minutes past the time. So thank you so much for everybody that's joined in early, very early morning. From the hospital bed, as well as others who are just not even there with their cups of coffee, as well as those that are hungry for lunch here in India, as well as maybe those that have joined us from the further part of the world. So thank you so much. This was just a stirring up of saying we are all perhaps biased and we need to recognize that. And there are lots of takeaways. Possibly would love to hear from everybody one-on-one separately. Me and Rashi and Swaroop had some ideas about how to take this forward. Still haven't framed that across, but love to engage with everybody that's turned up here on that journey with us. So thank you so much. Over to you, Smita.
Okay, I have just put the LinkedIn group on the chat box. You can continue, all of you can continue the discussion on that group as well. Hope everybody has got some triggers. Anita, Rashi, Swaroop, thank you so much for all the wisdom, and Suya and Cindy for joining. Komal, thank you. Shweta, thank you too. Thank you, everybody. And we have 2 more sessions coming up, 7:30 p.m. IST and 10:30 p.m. IST. Do join. In case you're not able to, there'll be recordings available. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.